The scream, when it came, was not a child's high-pitched shriek of play, but a raw, tearing sound of pure terror, abruptly choked off, replaced by a sickening thud and a guttural grunt of effort that spoke of violence. Aaliyah Washington, halfway through her morning run on the manicured, dewy paths of the Oak Haven estates, froze mid-stride, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs, every nerve ending alight. The sounds had come from just around the bend, near the community's overly elaborate, vaguely Grecian-style clubhouse and pool complex. It was early, the sun just beginning to burn off the morning mist, the air still cool and smelling of damp earth and chlorine. Most of Oak Haven's affluent residents were still asleep or sipping coffee behind their perfectly painted front doors. This was supposed to be her sanctuary, this meticulously planned enclave of expensive homes and artificial tranquility, a place she moved to 6 months ago seeking a quiet counterpoint to the brutal realities of her professional life. But Aaliyah was a federal civil rights prosecutor for the Department of Justice, and her ears, her instincts were attuned to the subtle and not so subtle frequencies of human distress and injustice. That sound, that horrible truncated scream, was a dissonance she couldn't ignore. She broke into a sprint, her running shoes silent on the asphalt path, her breath catching in her throat. As she rounded the curve, screened by a meticulously trimmed hedge of flowering azaleas, the scene that unfolded before her sent a jolt of ice-cold fury through her veins, a fury so potent it momentarily stole her breath. A uniformed figure, large and bulky in the navy blue attire of Oak Haven's private security force, HOA Patrol, emblazoned on his sleeve, had a black teenager pinned face down on the concrete pathway. The boy, slender and long-limbed, was struggling, a muffled sob escaping him. One of the officer's knees was pressed hard into the boy's back, the other pinning his legs. The officer's meaty hand was forcefully twisting one of the boy's arms up behind him at an unnatural angle. The boy cried out, again a sound of sheer agony. "Stop, please, you're hurting me, I didn't do anything." His voice was young, cracking with fear and pain. "You shut your mouth, punk!" the officer snarled, his face contorted with a vicious exertion that had nothing to do with maintaining control and everything to do with inflicting pain. "Resisting arrest, huh? We'll see about that." He yanked the boy's arm higher, and Aaliyah saw the teenager's body arch, his face contorting. This wasn't an arrest. This was an assault, pure and simple, and Aaliyah Washington knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was not just a resident of Oak Haven anymore. She was a witness, and she was about to become much, much more. "Hey," Aaliyah shouted, her voice, sharp, authoritative, cutting through the morning stillness. "Get off him. Now, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" The officer, startled, twisted his head, his eyes small and hard, beneath the brim of his cap, fixing on her with a look of pure belligerence. He didn't release the boy. If anything, he seemed to press down harder, a petty show of dominance. "This is official HOA business, ma'am. Stay back." This kid was trying to break into the vending machines, caught him red-handed. Aaliyah's eyes flicked to the nearby vending machines, untouched, their glass fronts gleaming in the early light. Then back to the boy, whose face, now turned slightly towards her, was streaked with tears and beginning to swell around one eye. He looked terrified, disoriented, and young, no more than 16. And she noticed something else, a slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes didn't quite focus when he looked up in panic, a subtle dissonance in his reactions that pinged a different kind of alarm in her prosecutor's brain, a brain trained to see not just facts, but vulnerabilities. "Bullshit," Aaliyah said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I saw you. You're assaulting him. Let him up. Now. Or the next call I make will be to the actual police and then to my office." She let that last phrase hang in the air, a deliberate, calculated ambiguity. The officer, whose name tag read K. Miller, sneered. "Your office, lady. I am the authority here, and you're interfering with an arrest. You want to be next." He was used to intimidating residents, used to unquestioned power within the manicured confines of Oak Haven. He clearly didn't recognize her, didn't know who he was dealing with. He just saw a woman, a black woman at that, in running clothes, challenging him. Aaliyah took a deliberate step closer, her eyes like chips of ice. "Officer Miller, your authority extends to securing property and observing, not to acting as judge, jury, and executioner on a public pathway. You are using excessive force on a minor. I am ordering you as a witness to a felony assault to release him immediately." She pulled out her phone. "You have 3 seconds before I dial 911 and report an officer-involved assault in progress. And believe me, given what I do for a living, they will listen." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the lack of fear, finally seemed to penetrate Miller's arrogant belligerence. Or perhaps it was the phone and the dawning realization that this woman wasn't backing down. He hesitated, his grip loosening fractionally on the boy's arm. That was all the opening Aaliyah needed. She was already dialing. 911. "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice came through clearly on speakerphone before Miller could react further. "Yes," Aaliyah said, her eyes locked on Miller, never wavering. "My name is Aaliyah Washington. I am at the Oak Haven Estates Clubhouse, 2000 Oak Haven Drive. I am witnessing an assault in progress by a uniformed HOA security officer, badge number K. Miller, on a juvenile male. Request immediate police and medical assistance. The officer is using excessive force, and the juvenile is injured." Miller's face went from red to a pasty white. He finally reluctantly released the boy, scrambling to his feet, trying to regain some semblance of composure. The boy lay there whimpering, trying to curl into himself. Aaliyah didn't approach the boy yet, not while Miller was still a potential threat. She stayed on the line with the dispatcher, providing more details, her voice a calm, professional monotone that belied the fury still coiling in her stomach. She knew with a chilling certainty that this was not just an isolated incident of a bad security guard. This was a symptom of something rotten, something that festered in the quiet, privileged enclaves like Oak Haven, something her entire career was dedicated to fighting, and it had just landed quite literally on her doorstep. The quiet life she had hoped for in Oak Haven had just ended before it truly began. The fight had found her. Aaliyah Washington's path to becoming a top federal civil rights prosecutor had been paved with a fierce intellect, an unshakable moral compass, and a deep-seated anger at injustice that had been ignited in her childhood. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, she had seen firsthand how easily power could be abused, how quickly rights could be trampled, especially for those who lacked the voice or the means to fight back. A particular incident involving a beloved uncle, a good man wrongly accused and mistreated by local police, had galvanized her resolve. She'd devoured books, excelled in school, pushing herself relentlessly through undergrad and then Harvard Law, her focus always clear. She would be a weapon for the voiceless, a shield for the vulnerable. Her work at the Department of Justice was demanding, often heartbreaking. She'd prosecuted hate crimes, police brutality cases, human trafficking rings. She'd stared down bigots and corrupt officials in courtrooms across the country, her quiet demeanor belying a razor-sharp legal mind and a bulldog tenacity. She was good at her job, respected by her colleagues, feared by her opponents. But it took a toll. The constant exposure to the darkest aspects of human behavior, the endless battles, the weight of responsibility had left her weary. Oak Haven Estates, with its lush landscaping, its tranquil cul-de-sacs, and its promise of a safe, orderly environment, was supposed to be her respite. She'd bought a modest townhouse there, hoping for quiet weekends, a place to decompress, to recharge, before plunging back into the fray. She deliberately kept a low-profile content to be just another resident, nodding politely to neighbors, enjoying the anonymity. She hadn't delved into the HOA. Politics hadn't paid much attention to their private security force beyond a cursory glance at their ever-present golf carts patrolling the pristine streets. She had perhaps naively assumed that in a community that prided itself on its exclusivity and high property values, basic decency and respect for the law would be a given. That illusion had shattered on the concrete path by the pool. The teenager whose name she soon learned was Jamal Henderson was the only son of David and Simone Henderson, a software engineer and a history professor respectively. The Hendersons were one of a handful of black families in Oak Haven, a community that boasted diversity in its brochures but often struggled with it in practice. Jamal was 17, a bright, sensitive kid who loved anime, and was a gifted artist, his sketches often filled with fantastical creatures and intricate worlds. He also had autism spectrum disorder. It manifested for Jamal primarily in social communication challenges and sensory sensitivities. Under stress, he could become overwhelmed sometimes, freezing, sometimes engaging in repetitive behaviors like hand flapping or rocking, his ability to process verbal commands or make eye contact significantly impaired. He was in the parlance of his therapists often Literal Leo, meaning he took things at face value, unable to easily read subtext or sarcasm, which could make interactions with strangers, especially authority figures, fraught with misunderstanding. The Hendersons had moved to Oak Haven 2 years prior, drawn by the reputation of its schools and the promise of a safe environment for Jamal, who had been bullied in his previous more urban school. They were doting parents, fiercely protective of Jamal, and had worked tirelessly to equip him with strategies to navigate a world that often didn't understand him. They'd even provided the HOA management office with a discreet information card about Jamal explaining his condition and how best to communicate with him in case of any issues, a proactive measure born of love and a weary understanding of societal ignorance. That card, Aaliyah would later discover, had been filed away and forgotten, or perhaps more chillingly ignored. Officer Kurt Miller, the HOA security guard, was a different story altogether. In his late 40s, he was a man whose life seemed to be a series of resentments and failures, masked by a carefully cultivated veneer of aggressive authority. He'd washed out of the police academy years ago, a fact he conveniently omitted from his Oak Haven patrol application. He'd bounced through a series of low-level security jobs before landing the Oak Haven gig, where the illusion of power and the crisp uniform seemed to inflate his already overblown ego. He saw himself as the thin blue line protecting Oak Haven's privileged residents from the perceived chaos of the outside world, a chaos he often equated with anyone who didn't look or act like his narrow definition of acceptable. He had a history of complaints within Oak Haven, mostly from minority residents or teenagers, for harassment, for overstepping his authority, for being overly aggressive about petty rule infractions like parking violations or loitering on community benches. These complaints, however, had always been quietly dismissed by the HOA board, who valued Miller's proactive and no-nonsense approach to security, an approach that many residents, particularly older white residents, lauded as keeping the neighborhood safe and orderly. The inciting incident, the spark that eventually led to the explosion Aaliyah witnessed, had occurred a week earlier. Jamal had been sitting on a park bench near the community lake, sketching in his notepad, listening to music through his headphones. He was stimming slightly, rocking gently, lost in his own world. Officer Miller on patrol had seen him. To Miller, a black teenager alone, rocking headphones on, immediately translated to suspicious. He'd approached Jamal aggressively, demanding to know what he was doing, who he was. Jamal, startled, overwhelmed by the sudden loud confrontation, had struggled to respond. His words jumbled, his gaze averted. Miller had grabbed his arm, yanking off his headphones, shouting at him about disrespect and vagrancy. Jamal, terrified, had pulled away and fled home, leaving his sketchbook behind. David and Simone Henderson had been furious. They had gone to the HOA management office, complained about Miller's harassment of their son, reminded them about Jamal's ASD and the information card they had provided. They were met with polite but dismissive platitudes from the HOA manager, a woman named Janice, who promised to speak with Officer Miller, but clearly viewed the incident as a minor misunderstanding, perhaps even subtly implying that Jamal's condition might have contributed to the problem. Miller, when Janice did speak to him, received not a reprimand, but a quiet word of encouragement to keep an eye on that Henderson boy, because you know how some people are always looking for trouble or a handout. The prejudice was subtle, insidious, but unmistakably present. Miller had taken it as a green light. He now had a target. The assault Aaliyah witnessed was the culmination of this festering animosity and Miller's unchecked aggression. The false allegation of Jamal trying to break into the vending machines was a complete fabrication, a pretext Miller had concocted when he saw Jamal walking near the clubhouse that morning, probably on his way to retrieve his forgotten sketchbook. Jamal, seeing Miller approach, had likely panicked, perhaps tried to walk away quickly, which Miller, already spoiling for a confrontation, had interpreted as guilt and an attempt to flee. He'd grabbed Jamal, who, overwhelmed by the sudden physical contact and fear, had instinctively tried to pull free. This, in Miller's twisted view, was resisting, and he had responded with the brutal force Aaliyah had walked in on. The arrival of the county police officers and paramedics was swift. Aaliyah, her professional demeanor firmly in place, gave a concise, factual statement to the first responding officer, a young sergeant whose eyes widened slightly when she, in response to his request for her details, quietly stated her name and occupation. Aaliyah Washington, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. It wasn't a threat, just a fact, but it hung in the air, instantly changing the dynamics. Officer Miller, now looking considerably less arrogant and more like a cornered rat, was separated and questioned. Jamal thankfully was not seriously injured, though he was bruised, terrified, and deeply traumatized. His parents arrived, Simone's face a mask of anguish and fury, David's a stoic but seething rage. Aaliyah spoke with them quietly, reassuringly, her empathy genuine, but her mind already working, already strategizing. This isn't just an assault, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, Aaliyah said to them after Jamal had been checked by paramedics and was clinging to his mother. This is a civil rights violation. And what happened to Jamal today, I suspect, is not an isolated incident. Officer Miller, and possibly the entire Oak Haven security apparatus, needs to be investigated thoroughly. David Henderson looked at her, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. We've tried to complain before. About Miller. About the way Jamal, the way we are sometimes treated here. It's like talking to a brick wall. They protect their own. Brick walls can be broken down, Aaliyah said, a grim determination in her voice. Sometimes you just need the right tools and the right leverage. She was that leverage. She was that tool. And she was going to dismantle this particular wall brick by painstaking brick if necessary. The immediate aftermath saw Officer Miller suspended by the HOA, pending an internal investigation, a move Aaliyah knew was purely for show, a way to try and contain the damage. The county police took their reports, but Aaliyah sensed a reluctance on their part to aggressively pursue charges against an HOA security officer over what might be dismissed by some as an overzealous arrest. Private security often existed in a gray area of jurisdiction, and local departments were sometimes hesitant to step on the toes of powerful HOAs and their influential residents. This was exactly the kind of systemic gap that allowed abuses to flourish. Aaliyah knew she couldn't rely on local law enforcement alone, nor on the Oak Haven HOA to police itself. She spent the next few days quietly gathering information. She spoke again with the Hendersons, learning more about Jamal, his disability, and their previous interactions with Miller and the HOA. She walked the paths of Oak Haven, not as a resident seeking tranquility, but as an investigator observing, listening. She subtly approached other minority residents, other families, with teenagers inquiring about their experiences with HOA patrol. A pattern began to emerge. Stories of unwarranted stops, of being asked for ID while walking in their own neighborhood, of dismissive or hostile attitudes from certain security officers, particularly Miller. There were tales of teenagers, especially Black and Latino boys, being accused of loitering or making noise, their presence in public community spaces treated as inherently suspicious. Most of these incidents had gone unreported officially, or if they were, they had been brushed aside. There was a climate of low-level intimidation, a sense that some residents were more welcome, more protected than others. The first shocking incident that escalated Aaliyah's resolve from a quiet investigation to a more overt offensive occurred about a week after the assault on Jamal. The Hendersons, on Aaliyah's advice, had filed a formal detailed complaint with the HOA board demanding Miller's termination and a formal apology. They had also bravely decided to speak to a local investigative reporter Aaliyah knew from a previous case, someone known for her tenacity and commitment to social justice issues. The story of Jamal's assault, carefully and factually reported, hit the local news, sending ripples of unease through Oak Haven. The HOA board's response was not contrition, but aggression. They hired a high-powered law firm, clearly signaling their intent to fight. And then the harassment began. Suddenly, the Hendersons started receiving anonymous, racially charged hate mail delivered to their home. Their car tires were slashed one night. Jamal, already traumatized, became afraid to leave the house. David Henderson, a calm and measured man, was visibly shaken when he called Aaliyah. "They're trying to intimidate us, Aaliyah. They're trying to silence us. This isn't just about Miller anymore. This is about something much uglier in this community." Aaliyah felt a cold rage. This was classic retaliation, a despicable tactic she'd seen used by entrenched corrupt systems before. This was an attempt to coerce, to bully a family into submission. "David," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "This changes things. This is a federal offense. Witness intimidation, hate crimes. They've just escalated this far beyond an HOA dispute." She immediately contacted her colleagues at the FBI. The second shocking incident followed swiftly, this time aimed indirectly at Aaliyah herself. The HOA board, now aware that Aaliyah Washington was not just a concerned resident, but a federal prosecutor. The Hendersons, in their fear and anger, had mentioned seeking her counsel tried to discredit her. They couldn't attack her professionally, not directly, so they resorted to petty, insidious tactics. Suddenly, Aaliyah started receiving notices for bogus HOA violations. Her grass was supposedly a quarter-inch too long. Her recycling bin was allegedly put out on the wrong day. A guest's car was parked improperly for 10 minutes. These were transparent attempts to harass and annoy her, to paint her as a troublemaker within the community to undermine her credibility. They even floated a rumor through the Oak Haven gossip mill that she had orchestrated the incident with Jamal to further her own career or to stir up racial tensions. The audacity, the sheer malice of it was breathtaking. But Aaliyah was unfazed. If anything, it hardened her resolve. They were clearly terrified, and terrified people made mistakes. She documented every instance of harassment, every communication. She knew that these actions, born of arrogance and a desperate attempt to maintain control, would ultimately contribute to their undoing. The HOA board, led by a wealthy, imperious man named Arthur Prescott, who viewed Oak Haven as his personal kingdom, was overplaying its hand. They were so used to their power being absolute within their little fiefdom that they couldn't comprehend they were now challenging the full weight of the United States Department of Justice. Aaliyah realized that to truly break this cycle, she needed more than just Miller's prosecution. She needed to expose the systemic rot within the HOA's security apparatus and potentially within the private security industry that supplied and often inadequately trained these quasi-police forces. This was bigger than Oak Haven. This was about the dangerous gray area where private authority, often unchecked and biased, intersected with the fundamental civil rights of individuals. The midpoint twist, the revelation that would significantly alter the trajectory of the case and broaden its scope, came from an unexpected source. A young, visibly nervous HOA administrative assistant who had worked in the management office for less than a year contacted Aaliyah anonymously. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah had been increasingly disturbed by what she was witnessing, the shredding of documents, after Jamal's assault, the closed-door meetings between Prescott, the HOA lawyers, and the regional manager of Titan Security, the private firm that employed Officer Miller and the other Oak Haven guards. She'd overheard snippets of conversations, veiled threats, discussions about containing the damage and making sure Miller keeps his mouth shut. Driven by her conscience, and perhaps a healthy dose of fear, after seeing how the Hendersons were being treated, Sarah arranged a clandestine meeting with Aaliyah in a coffee shop far from Oak Haven. She brought with her a USB drive. I copied some files, Sarah whispered, her hands trembling as she slid the drive across the table. Internal memos, incident reports that were never filed, officially training materials for Titan Security. There's a lot, Ms. Washington. Miller, he wasn't the only one. There's a pattern, especially with how they deal with people who aren't white or kids they think are delinquents. And Titan Security, their training seems to encourage aggressive tactics. There are bonuses for incident resolutions, which sounds like it rewards confrontation, not de-escalation. Aaliyah took the drive, her heart quickening. Sarah, you've done a very brave thing, a very important thing. Are you safe? Sarah nodded, though her eyes were still wide with anxiety. I think so. I'm quitting at the end of the week. I can't be a part of this anymore. The contents of that USB drive were explosive. It contained dozens of previously buried incident reports from Titan security guards across several HOAs. They serviced not just Oak Haven. Reports detailing aggressive confrontations, questionable uses of force, and a disturbing pattern of racial and class bias in how suspects were profiled and treated. There were internal Titan security emails discussing the need to manage liability and protect the company's reputation in the face of complaints. Most damningly, there were excerpts from Titan's training manual that actively encouraged guards to project authority, control the situation decisively, and use preemptive physical tactics to neutralize potential threats with little to no emphasis on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, or understanding disabilities. It was a playbook for aggressive, confrontational pseudo-policing, and there was more. Sarah had also copied financial records showing a close, almost uncomfortably cozy relationship between Arthur Prescott, the Oak Haven HOA president, and the regional director of Titan Security. Large, vaguely defined consulting fees paid by the HOA to Titan above and beyond their standard security contract. It hinted at a level of collusion, perhaps even a kickback scheme where Prescott ensured Titan's lucrative contract was renewed without scrutiny, in exchange for Titan providing guards who would aggressively enforce Prescott's vision of an orderly and implicitly homogeneous community and who would look the other way or suppress incidents that might reflect badly on the HOA or Titan itself. This was the turning point. It was no longer just about Officer Miller's assault on Jamal Henderson or even the Oak Haven HOA's attempts to cover it up. This was about a potentially corrupt and abusive private security firm operating with impunity across multiple communities, their actions shielded by powerful HOAs and a lack of effective oversight. Aaliyah now had evidence of a systemic problem, one that reached far beyond the manicured lawns of Oak Haven. Her case had just gone from local to potentially national in scope. She now had the leverage she needed to bring not just Miller down, but to challenge the very way private community policing was conducted. The Department of Justice would have to take this very seriously. The fight for Jamal was about to become a fight for countless others. Armed with the damning evidence from Sarah's USB drive, Aaliyah moved with precision and determination. She briefed her superiors at the Department of Justice, laying out the systemic issues, uncovered the pattern of abuse by Titan Security, and the potential corruption involving the Oak Haven HOA. The DOJ, recognizing the broader implications, greenlit a full federal investigation, not just into Officer Miller and the Oak Haven HOA, but into Titan Security's operations across the state and potentially beyond. Aaliyah was appointed to lead the task force. The quiet suburban prosecutor was now spearheading a major federal probe. The news of the federal investigation sent shockwaves through Oak Haven and the private security industry. Arthur Prescott, the imperious HOA president, suddenly found himself facing federal scrutiny, his carefully cultivated image of respectability crumbling. Titan Security's regional director went into damage control mode, issuing public statements about their commitment to professionalism and community safety, while privately, their lawyers scrambled. Officer Miller, already suspended, was now facing the prospect of federal civil rights charges far more serious than any local assault charge he might have faced. The power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. The climax of this phase of the struggle was not a courtroom showdown, not yet, but a meticulously planned community meeting in Oak Haven. Aaliyah, in her capacity as a resident, had requested it ostensibly to discuss community safety and HOA transparency in light of recent events. The HOA board, under immense pressure and advised by their increasingly nervous lawyers, had reluctantly agreed. The meeting was held in the Oak Haven Clubhouse Auditorium, the very same complex where Jamal had been assaulted. It was packed. Residents, anxious, angry, confused, filled every seat. The Hendersons were there, sitting in the front row, a quiet symbol of dignity and resilience. Jamal, though still healing, was there too, a brave young man, determined to see this through. Arthur Prescott and the remaining HOA board members sat on the stage, looking uncomfortable and defensive. Representatives from Titan Security were also present, their faces grim. Aaliyah began by speaking as a resident, her voice calm but firm, recounting what she had witnessed the assault on Jamal. She spoke of the fear and intimidation the Hendersons had faced. She spoke of the concerns other residents had shared with her about HOA patrol's conduct. Then, as Prescott started to bluster to dismiss her concerns as isolated incidents and exaggerations, Aaliyah paused. "Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice dropping slightly, taking on a new edge of authority. "These are not isolated incidents, and my concerns are not mere exaggerations. Perhaps I should reintroduce myself. My name is Aaliyah Washington. I am a resident of Oak Haven, yes. But my professional life is spent as a senior litigator for the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice." A stunned silence fell over the auditorium. You could have heard a pin drop. Prescott's jaw literally dropped. The Titan Security representatives exchanged panicked glances. Aaliyah let the silence hang for a moment, then continued, her voice now resonating with the full weight of federal authority. "And in that capacity," she went on, "I can tell you that my office has opened a formal investigation into the assault on Jamal Henderson, into allegations of witness intimidation and hate crimes within this community, into the operational practices of Titan Security, and into the conduct and potential corruption of the Oak Haven HOA board in relation to these matters." She then proceeded methodically, factually, to lay out some of the initial findings without compromising the ongoing investigation. She spoke of the pattern of biased complaints, the aggressive training materials of Titan Security, the buried incident reports. She didn't present all her evidence, just enough to make it undeniably clear that this was not just about one rogue officer, but a systemic failure, a culture of abuse and impunity. she spoke of the courage of whistleblowers and the importance of transparency and accountability. When she finished, the auditorium was initially silent. Then a low murmur rose, quickly growing into an uproar. Residents were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding answers from Prescott and the board. Some expressed outrage at what had been happening under their noses. Others, long intimidated by Prescott's authoritarian rule, found their voices sharing their own negative experiences with HOA patrol. A few die-hard Prescott supporters tried to defend him, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming tide of anger and disillusionment. Prescott, visibly shaken, tried to regain control, but his bluster was gone, replaced by a desperate defensive quaver. The Titan security officials tried to offer platitudes about cooperation, but their words rang hollow. The climax was not one of violence, but of truth, revealed of power. Challenged of a community forced to confront an ugly reality it had long ignored or enabled. As the meeting devolved into chaos, with residents demanding Prescott's immediate resignation, Aaliyah watched, her expression grim but resolute. The first major battle had been won. The veil had been lifted. Now the harder work of achieving lasting justice and reform would begin. The federal agents waiting discreetly outside the clubhouse knew their time was coming. Arrests would follow, not just of Miller, but potentially of others who had enabled or participated in the cover-up and intimidation. The fall of the House of Prescott and the reckoning for Titan security was at hand. In the weeks that followed the explosive Oak Haven community meeting, the federal investigation gathered momentum with stunning speed. Officer Kurt Miller was arrested on federal civil rights charges, including deprivation of rights under color of law for the assault on Jamal Henderson. Arthur Prescott, the once arrogant HOA president, found himself indicted on charges of conspiracy witness, tampering, and mail fraud related to the hate mail sent to the Hendersons and his illicit financial dealings with Titan Security. Several other Titan security officials, including the regional director, faced charges related to systemic civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. The carefully constructed facade of Oak Haven's serene order had been shattered, revealing the ugliness it had concealed. The legal battles were intense. Prescott and the Titan executives hired expensive legal teams fighting every step of the way, but Aaliyah Washington and her DOJ task force had built an ironclad case, bolstered by Sarah's courageous whistleblowing, the digital evidence, and the testimony of numerous victims from Oak Haven and other communities serviced by Titan. One by one, the defendants saw the writing on the wall. Miller, facing overwhelming evidence and a long prison sentence, eventually pled guilty, offering a grudging court-mandated apology to Jamal and his family, though it rang hollow to those who knew the depth of his malice. Arthur Prescott, his reputation in tatters and his assets frozen, also negotiated a plea deal to avoid a potentially even longer sentence after a trial, his fall from grace spectacular and complete. He was forced to resign from all community positions, his name becoming synonymous with corruption and abuse of power. The Titan security executives involved also faced convictions, and the company itself was hit with massive federal fines and a consent decree that mandated a complete overhaul of its training, hiring, and operational protocols under strict federal monitoring. If they failed to comply, their license to operate would be revoked. For Jamal Henderson and his family, the journey was far from easy. The trauma of the assault and the subsequent harassment left deep scars. Jamal struggled with anxiety and fear for a long time, but with the unwavering support of his parents, dedicated therapists, and a community that was slowly learning and trying to make amends, he began to heal. He found his voice not just in his art, which became a powerful medium for expressing his experiences, but also as a young advocate speaking out about the rights of disabled individuals and the need for empathy and understanding. His courage was an inspiration. The Hendersons, while forever changed by their ordeal, channeled their anger and pain into constructive action, becoming active in local and national civil rights organizations. The Oak Haven community itself underwent a painful but necessary transformation. The HOA board was disbanded, replaced by a new, more diverse, and genuinely community-focused group of residents committed to transparency and inclusivity. They terminated the contract with Titan Security, opting instead for a smaller local security firm with a proven track record of de-escalation and community engagement, and implemented mandatory sensitivity and disability awareness training for all their staff. They issued a formal public apology to the Hendersons and established a fund to support community programs promoting diversity and civil rights education. The pristine lawns of Oak Haven began to feel a little less sterile, a little more real as the community grappled with its past and tried to build a more just future. But Aaliyah Washington's work was far from over. The Oak Haven case and the Titan security investigation had exposed a gaping wound in the landscape of American law enforcement, the largely unregulated and often unaccountable world of private security forces acting as quasi-police in residential communities. These entities, often staffed by individuals who couldn't make it into or had washed out of traditional law enforcement, armed and uniformed, wielded significant power over residents, but frequently lacked the training oversight and constitutional constraints that govern public police forces. The potential for abuse, as evidenced by Jamal's case, was enormous. Driven by this conviction, Aaliyah spearheaded a national initiative within the Department of Justice to address this issue. Drawing on the findings from the Titan investigation and working with civil rights organizations, law enforcement experts, and community advocates, her team began drafting federal legislation aimed at reforming private community policing nationwide. The proposed bill, which the media quickly dubbed Jamal's Law, sought to establish clear national standards for the hiring, training, and conduct of private security personnel operating in residential communities. It called for mandatory de-escalation training, implicit bias awareness, disability, sensitivity, education, and strict limits on use of force. It proposed a national database to track complaints and disciplinary actions against private security officers, preventing problematic individuals from simply moving from one company or community to another. Crucially, it aimed to clarify jurisdictional lines and ensure that private security abuses could be effectively investigated and prosecuted under federal civil rights statutes. The legislative process was a grueling uphill battle. Powerful lobbying groups representing the private security industry and some homeowners associations pushed back hard, arguing against federal overreach and unnecessary burdens. Aaliyah found herself once again in the halls of Congress, testifying before committees meeting with skeptical lawmakers, patiently but persistently making the case for reform. She used the Oak Haven story, Jamal's story, as a powerful illustration of why these changes were so desperately needed. The Hendersons and even Jamal himself on occasion joined her their personal testimonies, adding a profound human dimension to the complex legal arguments. Slowly, painstakingly, they built a coalition of support drawing in lawmakers from both sides of the aisle who were moved by the clear injustice and the evident need for better safeguards. The resolution of this broader struggle came nearly 2 years after Jamal's assault. After months of negotiations, amendments, and passionate debate, Jamal's Law was passed by Congress and signed into law by the President. It was a landmark achievement, a significant step towards ensuring that all communities, regardless of whether their security was provided by public police or private firms, were protected by individuals who were properly trained, accountable, and committed to upholding the civil rights of every resident. Aaliyah watched the signing ceremony from the White House Rose Garden, a quiet sense of profound satisfaction washing over her. It wasn't a complete victory, no law ever is, but it was a monumental stride forward. In the end, Officer Miller served time in federal prison. Arthur Prescott lost his wealth and his freedom. Titan Security was forced to fundamentally change its abusive practices or face extinction. The Oak Haven community, humbled and chastened, embarked on a journey of healing and rebuilding, striving to become the truly inclusive and safe haven it had always claimed to be. Jamal Henderson, no longer just a victim, but a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change, went off to college to study art and advocacy, his future bright with promise. Aaliyah Washington remained at the Department of Justice, her commitment to the fight for civil rights undiminished, perhaps even strengthened by the Oak Haven ordeal. She knew that the struggle for justice was a marathon, not a sprint filled with moments of frustration and despair, but also with moments of profound hope and transformative change. She had sought peace in Oak Haven and had instead found a battle. But in fighting that battle for Jamal, for a community, and ultimately for a nation, she had helped to forge a more just peace, one built not on illusion and exclusion, but on accountability, empathy, and the unshakable belief in the inherent dignity and rights of every individual. The echoes of that choked-off scream on a quiet morning path had been answered not just with arrests and convictions, but with a new legal framework designed to prevent such screams from ever being necessary again. The positive, powerful resonance of that victory, achieved against a backdrop of entrenched power and prejudice, would linger for a very long time, a testament to what one determined individual, armed with truth and justice, could achieve.